Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this lovely Thursday evening slash afternoon. My name is Adi Eshman.
I'm Jason Jones.
Welcome to Bushwick Politic. We have a very special guest for you today. We are going to be speaking with Amer Ahmed, who's going to be talking with us a little bit about his writing and about what he's been really focused on in looking at today's moment, but maybe with a historical context. Um, Maybe we can talk about what's happened this week first off. Jason, anything really capturing the news this week?
Yeah, the main thing that's kind of been on my mind, and I'm sure on everyone's mind, is this Supreme Court Justice confirmation. Amy Coney Barrett is lining up like she is going to really set the country back at least 50 to 100 years at a crucial point in time where we really need progressive thinking. Some of her, I don't watch C-SPAN just because, it drags. But, just looking at some of the highlights from her confirmation hearings, it really is troublesome to see the, overall lack of touch with reality. I think today her interviews consisted of her being questioned on the environment, and she basically refused to acknowledge that climate change was even a thing. And that's the person we're confirming to make the decisions over the country. So it's not looking good. But
I watched a little bit of the hearings. I didn't watch too much just because, at a certain point, it's like it's basically political theater. Like, she will be confirmed. And this, it's really like Senate Republicans twisting the knife at this point. One thing that I was paying attention to this week were the fake ballot boxes that the California Republican Party dropped all around the state. Right now they're being threatened with a cease and desist order from the California government. It might go to the courts. The California Republican Party dropped 50 fake ballot boxes around the state, primarily in gun stores and churches, with the title "Official Ballot Box" printed on the sides of them. And we have yet to see what will be the outcome of this. I mean, it's pretty, it seems like from the little bit of research I've done into this, like they were afraid like Trump voters wouldn't have their votes counted, so that's why they dropped these ballot boxes off. On the other hand, it's like, are they also trying to, change the electoral results in California, where a state that's reliably blue? So I don't quite understand the logic of this, but it's crazy that this actually isn't illegal. What they're doing is not actually illegal, because it's legal for like a third party, like take votes. So either way, it's crazy, and we'll see like what happens in the courts with that. Amir, what have you been paying attention to this week in terms of the news?
Well, I follow the Supreme Court, and basically it's more of a big campaign advertisement for the Senate races. So everyone knows that she'll be confirmed, but Lindsey Graham's getting a lot of spotlight. Some of the other Republican senators are too. I think there was a poll today that came out where he actually has a bump, and he's up on Jamie Harrison. So that's a big, basically a big race to win because it's very tenable. And then I also think it'll galvanize Democrats to go out and vote. And there's been record fundraising numbers. I think Biden pulled in close to $400 million in September. So I think it can be a double-edged sword because she'll definitely be on the court, but it could definitely mobilize a lot of people to vote, and then we can pack the court if we have a majority in the Senate. So it's definitely not a good development, but you can try to find a silver lining.
Yeah. Jason, what were you going to say?
Oh, no, I was just going to say a quick update to your story. I heard just a few minutes ago, as far as the ballot boxes, the governor did sue over that. And what the Republican Party did was they removed the words official from the ballot boxes, but they didn't go through the trouble of removing the ballot boxes themselves. So it still says ballot box, just not official ballot box.
Yeah, still not illegal, which is the crazy part. Um, yeah, so Amer, let's talk a little bit about how you kind of came to your work as so you've been writing a lot of articles about how you see this moment in sort of like a historical context. Can you talk a little bit about what motivated you right now to start writing these articles?
Well, over the summer, I realized that people are a little bit historically illiterate in this country.
Mm,
And after the George Floyd protests, I realized that people really have a vague understanding of their own history, let alone world history. And history really shouldn't repeat itself. So if we've learned lessons in the past, there's no reason to go through it again. And I feel there's a big lurch towards the far right. And essentially, studying Hitler and Nazism, those things are taboo. So it's even people who are very big history buffs, very small percentage of them are even going to pick up the subject. So I just felt people were very unaware of what was happening to them surrounding Nazi tactics, and then Trump's behavior surrounding the pandemic. He's smart enough to know that you should wear a mask, you should quarantine, you should socially distance. And then I always felt that he wasn't being totally truthful, but I slowly realized he was spinning a myth around the pandemic in order to deny its existence. And it's basically a technique called magical fantasy, which Hitler used in the 1930s. And then he wanted to hide the true extent of the Holocaust. So he used magical fantasy. And then as I was writing, the Woodward tapes came out, which confirmed what I was suspecting. And then that motivated me to finish.
what is magical fantasy? What is that tactic?
So essentially, you create an alternative reality that your supporters live in, and your supporters believe in the myth of your greatness, which is called the Führer myth. And whenever they are confronted with a fact that contradicts the reality that you've created, they go through different cognitive behaviors in order to avoid that uncomfortable feeling, because since it contradicts their belief in you, gives them anxiety, and they want to go through a few different cognitive behaviors in order to ease that anxiety. And basically, Germany, Hitler, he created unified groupthink. So he wasn't this big dictator that threatened everyone with violence. He wanted his dictatorship to be a partnership with the German people. And he actually had a 95% approval rating. And he also talked about not wanting people's compliance. He wanted their conviction. So he knew people naturally conform. So he wanted them to conform into the Nazi Party's unified groupthink, which helped him create this magical fantasy around himself. And then eventually he used it on different policies that were important to him.
Fascinating. And looking towards 1945, I mean, what did it take to puncture that magical fantasy?
Well, the funny thing is that there's still people that believed in the fantasy even after World War II. There's famous quotes where Klemperer, he was a Jewish intellectual that survived the war, and he basically asked a worker in Berlin, he was shoveling debris, and the worker's like, there's no point understanding, like, I still believe in Hitler, he never lied to us. And in the last year of the war, Hitler basically called for no surrender, and he knew that Germany had little chance of fighting back the Allies. They faced the US on one side and England, and then they faced about 2 million soldiers from Russia. And basically, they gave fanatical resistance and fought to the death because the grip on them, it was just so strong, even though Germany was in rubble. And
Well,
literally days before he killed himself, he had Hitler Youth as young as 13 fighting the Russian army in the streets of Berlin.
one issue that you also raised in your article is the historical context of 1968 to the protests over the summer. Can you talk a little bit about your research into Richard Nixon and the law and order rhetoric and how that relates to today?
Okay, so basically, law and order is a racist dog whistle that comes from the Jim Crow South. So during the Jim Crow South, politicians, they used a lot of racial hatred to galvanize their voters. And they picked a common enemy because just like Hitler, they go after an ethnic minority, and then hatred bonds people together, which bonds them to their leader if the leader shares that hatred. So basically, they openly use racial slurs, but as we moved into World War II, and then after World War II, Americans, after fighting the Nazis, realized we pretty much had the same ideas of segregation and racial purity as the Nazis, which kind of exposed us as hypocrites. And then people from Europe started to travel to the US more because we kind of became the center of gravity. And they started to point out that you have this Jim Crow system of segregation. It's totally appalling. So 40s, late 40s, Harry Truman, he desegregated the federal government in 1949 for the first time, I believe. And then in the 50s and 60s, it just became socially undignified to be openly racist, even though people had racial prejudices. So instead of saying the N-word and other racial epithets, they started using dog whistles. Instead of the N-word, they started saying thug. For liberals, they always go with anarchists, communists,
New Yorkers,
Yankees. Protests are always looting. And then when Trump said, when the looting starts, the shooting starts, that's direct quote from a racist police chief in Miami. So Law and Order has actually three main goals. It's to strike fear of Black crime, because at that time, white people didn't want to live with Black people. And then there's segregation in the South as well as the North. But as you go through school, they don't really teach you too much about the segregation in the North because it doesn't make the North look very good. And they wrote the history books. So basically, they feared Black crime spilling from the inner city into their suburbs. And even if they didn't have segregation, there were a lot of covenants where Black people just weren't allowed to buy houses in white neighborhoods. So that's part of the reason why Chicago's probably one of the most segregated cities in the country. And basically, when you say law and order, it reminds voters of that fear of Black crime. It also threatens people that would speak up for their rights with violence from the state. And then supporters can rationalize committing violence against protesters because it's not vigilante violence, it's from the state, so it's legalized. And then as a racist dog whistle, it incites racial hatred against the target minority. And then a lot of the racial hatred is based on politics of division rather than addition. So they believe that even if they turn off one voter, they can get 10 of their voters to actually vote because they're so whipped into a frenzy.
Fascinating. Thank you. Jason?
Gotcha. That brought up another question that I wanted to ask you, Amer. In your latest article, you talked about the silent majority. You gave an example of what I believe it was a governor's race, was it, in Alabama, that the winner, I guess, really banked on the fact that his racist policies would win through the hearts of the people. And he used that silent majority, like you said, in the late 60s, it was no longer popular to be outwardly racist. Yet when when a politician was, those people who, still felt those sentiments really pushed through the electorate and gave him the win. Now, I mean, that was the late 60s. Compared to now, I mean, obviously, the whole law and order thing, like you said, that's a racist dog whistle. It really creates the sense of almost like a black boogeyman type of thing.
Basically.
Do you feel that that's as powerful as a tool now as it was in the 60s?
Well, inherently, the middle class will always accept racism as long as it's dignified and not so overt, because they want to feel like they're good people and they live in a civilized state. So they're going to always be disgusted. But if you can kind of race bait them, there's always going to be an audience for that. But I feel that society's changed a lot because in 1968, the electorate was 90% white and 10% black. There wasn't people like me in this country. So black people didn't really have allies like they'd have now. So what's happening now that the suburbs, it's become multicultural. There is white people and they're used to living with people of different ethnicities. They're not lily white like they used to be. And then society as a whole has just become more racially tolerant. And then they have kids, they're used to having different minorities in their classes, and then they go off to college, they move to New York City. It's not so shocking to go to school with black people. And then a lot of people don't know that other ethnicities were segregated against too. In California, which you would consider a liberal state, Latinos had separate schools, Asians had separate schools, blacks had separate schools. If Latinos or Asians couldn't go to a separate Asian or Latino school, they would be sent to the all black school, even if it was 50 miles away from the white school that was clearly better. So it was very prevalent, and society's definitely taken a big step forward. And if you look at the electorate, it's 66% white now. Demographics are trending towards more multiculturalism. Down in Texas, about 25% of the electorate is Mexican. You didn't have the big Mexican influence in 1968. And then overall, Arizona, I think it's 20%. So that's going to make the electorate shift towards the Democratic Party, which has built itself as a multicultural party.
Mm-hmm. Well, speaking of the Supreme Court justice hearings, I heard one of the statistics recently that if Amy Coney Barrett gets confirmed, that will mean that a majority of the justices appointed to the court have been appointed by presidents who won the Electoral College but lost the popular vote. So I think what we're also talking about now is a time in which, like you're saying, the electorate is maybe not as white as it used to be. It's maybe not as conservative as it used to be. But now the minority party is basically controlling our institutions. In that sense, maybe you can compare it. Maybe the comparison that I make is maybe it's more similar to like a post-colonial government in the Middle East, controlled by an ethnic minority ruling over the majority of the people. I mean, does that, what comes up for you when something like that gets brought up?
Well, the Republican Party is a permanent minority. It's just the way it is. Even if you polled everyone right now, I think Republican Party would at most get 45% of the electorate on a good day. So to win, they would need 5% from independents or moderates. They would need someone to switch. A lot of Democrats from the working class switched to Trump in 2016. So when you're a permanent minority, you're going to do anything it takes to cling on to power. And their policies just aren't popular, or they would be the majority. It's like simple logical reasoning. So they're going to keep producing unpopular legislation that is going to make them more hated. So it's starting to become an apartheid government, which is in South Africa. There was a permanent minority of white people that created this apartheid government to oppress the majority of black people because they didn't want to give up power after the British left. So when you look at the Electoral College, the way it's set up, it skews towards these majority white, very unpopulated states. Wyoming, there's only 500,000 people. They have 2 senators. New York, I don't need to tell you, but you guys have the same amount of senators. So it just makes no sense. And then population is going to be based in these prosperous states. So Democrats are always going to win the popular vote, but you're going to have Montana with their 2 senators. You're going to have this electoral college where every state automatically gets 2 votes. So that gives outsized influence to these very small states that are thinly populated. So the next wave for the Democratic Party would be to win states in the Sun Belt, because a lot of people from all over the country are moving there because of the weather, economic opportunities. it's also getting a lot of migration from Mexico. People there are suburban voters that Trump has lost in significant numbers. So it's getting more multicultural. Republicans have lost the suburbs. So places like Phoenix, places like Houston, Atlanta, those suburbs were always Republican, but just Trump's behavior on the pandemic, his overt racism, he's appalled a lot of suburban women. So that's pretty much where the future of the Democratic Party lies. And then the traditional blue states of Pennsylvania, Michigan, sometimes Ohio, Wisconsin, those are just going to always be difficult for the Democratic Party.
It's interesting.
And why do you think that is? I mean, so yeah, I was going to say, why do you think that's become a thing? It seems like there has been a real shift as far as where party loyalties have lied. You know, looking at Michigan, what just happened there with those people trying to, plotting to kidnap the governor. Why do you think there really has been an extreme shift in the North Midwest towards kind of the right?
Well, I guess I am from the Midwest, so I have to live with it. We both have to live with it. Well, basically, the Republicans have been able to demonize the Democrats. So they feel the Democrats are wealthy, liberal elitists from the Hamptons rather than the working class Democrats, which Biden is the last representative of. So they feel that the Democratic Party has abandoned them, just how Southerners felt the Democratic Party abandoned them in the 60s because Lyndon B. Johnson, he signed the Civil Rights Acts. And then George Wallace, he was the Democratic governor of Alabama, but he ran as an independent, and he was able to grab a lot of the same working class votes as Trump has been able to grab in the Midwest, because they feel like they've been marginalized and forgotten, and people haven't really voiced their concerns, and they've lost prosperity. That's why I say the silent majority has become a shriveled minority. And they feel that because of globalization, free trade, which they've decided that the Democratic Party are proponents of, NAFTA was signed by Bill Clinton, and Trump has done a great job of demonizing Democrats as the party of corporate culture, while now the Republicans are the populist party, and they feel that Obama didn't do enough for them. And you can't say they are racist, because literally all the people Trump won voted for Obama. So it's more around economic lines, and it's very hard to convince them that Trump actually favors tax cuts for the 1%. His general agenda is for corporations, because they feel that even though he engages in these trade wars and it doesn't always work, at least he's trying. When Hillary Clinton and the establishment overlook them. And then there's always a feeling that they think the National Democrats look down on them for being from the Midwest. So a Democrat in Pennsylvania, he said that Hillary Clinton and the Democrats make me feel bad about myself. Donald Trump doesn't. He makes me feel valued. And then George Wallace, he exploited that same sense of white grievance or just the political divide between the party. And he said in a famous quote in 1968, "They've looked down on you and me for a long time, Democrats and Republicans. They've called us rednecks, but we're about to show them that there are sure a lot of rednecks in this country." So there is a sense of white grievance that you can exploit. And he also had a famous quote where he talks about national Democrats and then Southern Democrats. And he says, "I'm an Alabama Democrat. I'm not a national Democrat. And the difference is basically between a communist and a non-communist." So there is a cultural and political divide. And Trump's done a really good job of pushing that his economic agenda helps them, even though if you looked into the details, there's less manufacturing jobs across the Midwest. under his presidency. And then you can credit Biden for saving the automobile industry during his administration with Obama.
Thank you. Another historical, let's say, moment that we're going through is this pandemic. I mean, in your research in American history, are there any parallels you can draw between this moment that we're going through right now and, let's say, maybe the Spanish flu in 1919? You know, any similar political or economic shifts that we're seeing? For instance, I read an article once that said that the Spanish flu might be responsible for women winning the right to vote, in the sense that, you know, a lot of men were sickened by the Spanish flu. A lot of young working men were taken out by the Spanish flu, and maybe this empowered more women to go into the workforce and give them and galvanize them, like you say, to seek out a political voice. So, in your research, do you see any parallels to other times of pandemic?
Well, socioeconomically, I've read a lot about New York City. It's a book called Gotham. I definitely recommend it. It's about the history of New York City, and it won the Pulitzer. And basically, when New York City was part of the United States, because it actually was New Amsterdam, but in the beginning of U.S. history, there were pandemics all the time in New York City every 5 years. And basically all the rich people would flee for Westchester County or the Hamptons or New Jersey. And it was always the poor and minorities that were stuck in the city, and they always died disproportionately versus the wealthy white people that were able to escape. And basically the people that were able to escape, they had more capital. So of course they lost money because of the pandemic. They had the same quarantine measures as we've tried now. Quarantine measures aren't a communist takeover. Literally, US has been doing them for, I guess, 250 years, if we're talking about US history right now. So when they got back to New York City, they just had more chips to play with, while the poor and minorities, they were totally wiped out. So they had to start from below scratch. Many were indebted, and they had to work their way back to zero, which created this massive income inequality that you see in New York City. And basically, like, if you have capital, it grows faster than the rate of inflation. So you're going to see that now in the pandemic. You're going to see billionaires making billions of dollars. You're going to see a massive income inequality. You're just going to see a massive gap starting. It's already started, but you're going to really see the difference after the pandemic's over. And basically, the government can support the economy with stimulus, but it's very hard to make everyone whole. So it's going to be very hard for people to climb out. But then you have the Bezos of the world. A lot of people made money in New York City during the pandemic. They found ways to use it to their advantage. So you're going to have that. And then when it comes to politically, I can talk to you about the Spanish flu in regards to Wilson. So he actually hid the nature of the Spanish flu because he didn't want it to undermine the war effort. And US soldiers, they actually went to Europe with the Spanish flu, and they died of the Spanish flu in Europe. But basically, Hitler, Trump, I guess Wilson, they used the power of abstraction. So if something's vague and seems far away, it's going to just seem like something that isn't real to a viewer. And basically, people need to be punched in the mouth for them to see how something can impact them. So he knew that people weren't going to go over to Europe and investigate dead US soldiers of the Spanish flu. He was able to use the fog of crisis to blend the casualties of the Spanish flu and the war together. And then personally, he actually got the Spanish flu. So he hid that from the public. Just Trump was trying to hide his COVID statistics, his health in the recent 2 weeks. So Wilson, he actually had the Spanish flu. He didn't tell anyone. It pretty much weakened him and almost caused him to have strokes. So when he was negotiating the League of Nations at the end of World War I, he was in a weakened state where he didn't have the same ferocity and drive to stand up to the Europeans and get the League of Nations and the different points that he really wanted. Because in school, you're always taught about the 14 points and how it didn't work out. Part of the reason why it didn't work out is because the president had the Spanish flu and he just didn't have the energy to pursue it the way he normally would. And then he kind of limped out of office, and then Americans never really found out that he had the Spanish flu. And then he tried to create a magical fantasy around it in the United States too. And I think 600,000 people died.
Yeah. Fascinating.
I mean, going along with this theme of magical fantasy, I mean, you really do see the dangers of it and creating an alternative reality. I mean, that's one thing that me and Adik can, I'm sure, agree on, is the fact that, you know, when we're doing a lot of these shows and we're talking about the other side, we really see them almost living in an alternative reality. They really are viewing the world as different. They see facts as different. The same things aren't facts to them, you know. So I liked how you kind of got into, you know, one of the techniques of the person in charge, the Fuhrer, more or less, is, you know, his means of obscuring the truth. You know, obviously Hitler did that really well. But can you list some examples of the way Trump is currently doing that in order to, you know, convince his following to continue to follow him?
Okay, so fake news is actually a Nazi slogan. So when they campaigned, because the Nazis, they didn't come to power through some violent takeover, they actually were elected to office. And basically, Goebbels had a famous quote: "You should always accuse the opposition of what you are guilty of." So there's always negative press coverage of the Nazi Party. And in order to dilute that press coverage and win over their supporters and insulate them from the truth, they had to discredit the free press. And when Trump said the free press is the enemy of the people, that's actually a Hitler line from a famous speech where he said the liberal press is the enemy of the people. So they decided if they can delegitimize journalists when they produce stories that were critical of Hitler, that they could tell their supporters that these journalists were liars. They were just trying to attack the Nazi Party, because for the Nazi Party, journalists aren't bystanders. They are another political party to destroy. So if you said something negative about Hitler, they would come after you. It wouldn't be, oh, he's voicing his opinion, he's an objective journalist. It's, no, you're part of the opposition. So Trump, he had a famous interview with the New York Times. Basically, the Times asked, "We've covered you for 30 years. We've had a pretty good relationship. Why are you attacking us so much?" And he said, "I have to attack you guys, and I have to attack you guys early. So if I ever do anything wrong and you guys write a negative story about me, the people won't believe you." So it's a very concentrated effort to discredit the press. And then the Nazi Party had their own newspaper and their own political organs, and there are other alternative right-wing newspapers. So the goal is to discredit the mainstream press first, and then you funnel people towards the right-wing media, and then you funnel them towards your party's sponsored right-wing media. So that's why when Fox News reports anything negative about Trump, he always tells his supporters, basically, Fox News is liberal now. Every mainstream media source is smeared as liberal, even though different sources lean this way or that way. And then literally at a mainstream media source, there's journalists that just report the facts, and there's political commentators that debate each other and clearly define that they're not journalists. But the Nazi Party smeared them all for having a liberal bias. And then there's also a cultural bias that people have in the working class, that basically culture is dictated by the liberal elite intellectuals that look down on them for not being as educated, and Hitler exploited that. So it also comes to a point where they want to reject a fact that you might have just to thumb their nose at you, because they think, oh wow, he lives in New York City, like thinks he's so smart. People in Germany had the same reaction to the mainstream liberal thinkers, Albert Einstein's of Germany. Germany was very famous for having a lot of philosophers, intellectuals, scientists that they thumbed their nose at them in Berlin. They took pride in ignorance, basically. Like, fascism isn't an intellectual movement. It's all about diluting complex problems into catchy statements that are binary and all for nothing and do not allow for intellectual discourse. Mm-hmm. So it's a concentrated effort to destroy independent thought. Like, the first part of creating a totalitarian state is destroying intellectual thought and independent thought. And you need intellectualism to have independent thought. So basically, they wanted to destroy independent thought and just follow the thought process and the worldview of the Nazi Party. So when Trump goes after Fox News, he's going to refer his supporters to Breitbart. He's going to, was it Newsmax, One America? They're all very radical, a lot of virus disinformation, demonizing Democrats. Literally, I think Twitter is trying to crack down on them at this point, but he funnels a lot of traffic towards those outlets. And then you want to funnel traffic from them to an official state newspaper. I guess Trump is not as smart as Hitler. He never would start his own newspaper. I don't think he has the intellectual attention span, but he has had different public radios. He's kicked off their, like Voice of America. It's supposed to be a moderate radio station funded by the government to give people objective information about public policy, mostly older people. Listen to it. He has radical right-wing loyalists in charge of those outlets now. And he can't ban the media, which the Nazi Party eventually did, but you can try to distort reality as much as possible. Mm-hmm. And then ultimately, they want people to go from the radical right-wing media to thinking that the leader is the only source of truth, which is where Trump supporters are now. So it's an evolution from hating CNN to just thinking Trump is the only source of truth, which you can see when Trump wore a mask for the first time overnight. There was a 15% increase in mask usage by Republicans. That's how immediate it is.
Wow. And so, yeah, it's kind of crazy the power of the group think and just, how many sheeple there are. I found it really, interesting what you said about, really starting with control of, like you said, fascism isn't very intellectual. So, it really starts with control of the education. Hence, I'm sure Betsy DeVos, really starting the people who are currently being educated, the people who are being molded by this country's education system currently are really at a huge disadvantage. I feel like schools are teaching less now than they ever were. So it's a really interesting point. But
all right, I had a question for Amer, if that's okay.
Yeah, no, go for it.
Don't want to be long-winded.
Yeah, no, Amer. My question was, what was it? Oh, how have you personally been changed by delving deeply into, American and world history? I mean, I think you mentioned earlier that this was not something that you really grew up with. So what kind of was your journey to getting really interested in history and then, sort of digesting it and putting it out there for all of us to read?
Well, I did grow up with politics because my grandfather, he was a government minister in Bangladesh, and then he was ambassador to Malaysia and Libya. So growing up, politics wasn't taboo. like it was expected for you to have opinions on issues, and you're expected to have like a certain set of values. So my family leaned very hard to the left. So that was the expectation. And then you're expected to vote. Like you're not supposed to take elections off. So I kind of grew up with that. And basically, I always enjoyed history because, I didn't have that much time with my grandfather. I'm not going to say that I was sitting there in Parliament with him, like I wasn't even alive. So it created a sense of history for me because I'd have to go into the books to learn a lot about my own family. So I always enjoyed history. And then basically I majored in it in undergrad, and then I pivoted towards getting a master's in finance. So joined the corporate world, and I always read, I always kept up in my 20s, but the Obama years were peaceful. Like my parents did well, I did well. There wasn't this big conflagration that you have now. And then I just didn't voice my opinions too loudly, but I just feel that we're at a precipice now where, Martin Luther King, he said, complicity, silence is complicity. So I feel I'm at a point where I can lose 10 followers. I really don't care. So I'm going to speak my views. And then I realized on social media that, you can't really get all your views out. It's 10, 15 seconds on a story. So in order to really get my views out, I would have to write. So it was a gradual escalation. And even when Trump won, I was willing to give him some benefit of the doubt that he wouldn't be a total disaster. But I saw his, I saw his response to the pandemic, and I thought it was really frightening that he's willfully endangering tens of thousands of people have died because of him. Over 210,000 people have died because he's willfully endangering Americans. So that is when I was very pushed to say something.
And I think this is a question that I'm certainly wondering. I'm sure a lot of people who are watching this are wondering, which is how optimistic are you about the November election? And after the election in Germany in 1933, I mean that was a pretty steep drop until 1945. And of course, world history is forever changed because of that election in 33. I mean, is 2016, is that the 33 election in Germany that put the Nazi party in power? Or is this, sort of the pendulum swinging? We go from Obama to Trump and then to Biden.
I see 2016 as 1928 or the 1931 election because, first 1928, 29 was the first time the Nazi party got delegates in the German parliament. So now you have these QAnon conspiracy theorists that are going to be in Congress now. So the first inklings, Goebbels had a famous quote, "We went into the Reichstag like wolves among sheep." And then he said, if we ever obtain power, you're going to have to drag our corpses out of our offices. So it starts gradually. And then once they got enough delegates in parliament, they were able to take over different ministries within the government. So it was a parliamentary system. So they were never the majority party, but they allied with the establishment conservatives and they were able to create this block. And then Hitler always said the first two departments that you want to take over is the Ministry of Interior. That's why Trump has radicalized the Department of Homeland Security, because then you have your own security apparatus and you can control the police. And that's why Trump has basically radicalized the police in the United States, because no one on the left within Biden's platform is seeking to defund the police. They just want to actually reform the police and funnel $300 million to the police in order to do that. But after the Ministry of Interior, he said you want the Ministry of Education. Those are the first two that you want, because then you can start indoctrination as quickly as possible. And then you can change the country's school books, you can change the teachers, you can change the classrooms. Literally, there were 10-year-olds waging guerrilla warfare in 1945 against US soldiers. That's how quickly and deeply they were able to brainwash people. So Betsy DeVos is definitely a threat, and it's definitely a full-scale war against public schools because they want this country to lead hard to the right, and education's a great way to defeat ignorance. And this country has a tradition of promoting ignorance because a lot of separate but equal was based on a drive to provide people of color with inferior education so they would always have a subservient role in the US economy. So that is still a huge part of US culture, the education system. That's why the cities that have inner city schools, they don't get as, I'm not an expert on funding, but I can tell you they're very bad. So it's a legacy of the Jim Crow South. And I would say 2016 is 1932, where Hitler was chancellor, but he wasn't the ultimate power. And to come to power, he had to wait. He was appointed by President Hindenburg to chancellor. And then that was 1933. And then he was able to subvert the German justice system, Night of the Long Knives. And then in 1934, that was Night of the Long Knives. And then President Hindenburg actually died. So he had to wait for President Hindenburg to die because he was the one who actually won the election in 1932. The highest the Nazi party ever polled was, I think, 38%, 36%. So Hitler had a quote. He said, "You don't have to win over the majority of the people. You have to win over the majority of people that actually vote." So he never went into it with the idea that he was going to win over every liberal in Berlin. Like he said there's a certain point 3 weeks before an election that you've won over everyone that you can win over. There's no more point in campaigning. And he said it comes down to who mobilizes the masses. That's who decides who wins the election. And he said in the last couple of weeks of an election, it's not shouting at the wall, trying to convince Trump supporters to vote for Biden. And he said there's a certain point where you just can't win over people. There's only so many minds that you can win over. And he said in the last couple of weeks of an election, it's a battle of wills, and whoever's will is stronger and doesn't break and can get more supporters to the polls is the one that's going to win. So if you let Republicans deter you from voting because of long lines and voter suppression, you're going to let them break your will. And that's how people like Hitler and Trump come to power. So I see this election as 1934. It could be very much the last chance the U.S. has before we become a far-right authoritarian state in the model of Russia, I'd say.
All right. Thank you for that. Really, really, really nuanced answer. Is there anyone who's watching right now that has any questions for Amer? We have a few more minutes before we have to wrap up. Jason, did you have any more questions?
Well, yeah. One thing I did want to ask you was just for the audience members that didn't have a chance to look at your article in general, could you just give a summation of the thesis? What's the bottom line?
So basically, I think the main thing that gets people really confused is that, yes, Trump's creating a magical fantasy around the pandemic. He wants to deny its existence. He wants to downplay it. Like, people don't really understand like how. And then some people are just not willing to admit that he's such a sociopath that he's willing to endanger his own supporters in order to reopen the economy, boost his own re-election chances. But they think Trump doesn't know that masks literally can stop transmission. He knows all the science. He's very intelligent. So there's no point yelling at him about masks. Like, he doesn't want any visual reminders of the pandemic. He knows if you wear a mask, you're going to be reminded that there is a pandemic. If his supporters wear a mask, which is even worse, they're going to be reminded that there is a pandemic, and then they can't blame liberals for wearing masks. Like, literally, they go to a rally, they see everyone has a mask, they're gonna be like, oh fuck, like this could be real. And then he wants rallies. He knows people are gonna die of COVID, but he needs to have people in front of cameras in order to show that there's nothing wrong. There's literally at rallies, there's been in Tulsa, they removed stickers so people couldn't socially distance. He knows you need to socially distance. One person sneezed in the Oval Office and 30 people, including Trump, ran out. So he knows that you need to socially distance, and he tries to stay away from people as much as he can, but he can't have that on TV. That's why he gets so mad at reporters. He gets mad when they wear masks because he knows the camera's on the reporters, and then everyone knows there's a pandemic. It's another reminder. They've literally locked chairs together in the White House so reporters can't socially distance. So that's another reminder. And then he literally knows that rallies are going to kill people, but his brand of politics is similar to Hitler. When your brand of politics is so focused on the leader and his charisma, his energy, and that is the only way that you can galvanize your voters. Because to be honest, the Republican Party is nothing without Donald Trump. Like Mitch McConnell on the road is going to get 2 people to go vote. He might lose votes if you bring out Mitch McConnell. So Trump is all they have and their only chance, and he knows that. And then Hitler, he followed the same, he actually invented it. So last 2 weeks of an election, he would do 3 speeches a day, and he would literally go to villages, every town, major city in Germany. He would do 3 a days for 2 weeks, and then he would fly in a Condor private jet so he could get to every single village, and that's just unheard of for that time. And he always targeted people that were overlooked by mainstream politicians. He went to towns that didn't really get a lot of attention from mainstream politicians, and they suffered the most from the Great Depression. It's a common phrase: if the rich sneeze, the poor get cancer at this point. So he knew they were neglected, and he knew he didn't get, they didn't watch cable news. Like, not everyone sits and watches like CNN and C-SPAN in this country. Like, not everyone is like liberal Manhattan, like obsessed with what happened, this, that, and there. Like, even in Germany, he knew that you have to go out in front of the voters. And then he said, I'm going to remind them myself to go and vote. So that's what Trump is doing. He knows he needs to go and remind them himself to go vote. And that's the only chance he has to win. And just bitching at him about the pandemic and quarantines and masks is just like a waste of energy. Like, he knows the science. He's not a dumb man, but it's just part of his propaganda.
My last question for you, Amer, is, there's a lot of talk about from Trump's side about there not being a peaceful transition to power if Trump should lose and Biden should win. What are your thoughts on these threats that there won't be a peaceful transition to power?
At this point, I think it's kind of like insecurity and desperation. It's kind of like, because a real strong man doesn't threaten democracy because he's confident of his position. And then literally, strong leaders in history never questioned the will of the people. They just had the confidence that they had it. And Stalin, he had a famous quote. He's like, let the people have an election. It'll make them feel good to think that they have any influence on important events will still win anyways. So he's making these threats from a position of weakness. And when Hitler was chancellor, he still had to wait for the president to die. And he had totally subverted German law and taken over multiple organs of the German government. And he had the backing of the German military and the conservative establishment. So yes, even Mitch McConnell isn't backing Trump on this. He has some toy soldiers. Like, they're not going to be able to overthrow the military of the United States of America. And maybe he has loyalists in the military in the police. I'm more worried about the police not enforcing voting laws. I think that's the weakness in any sense of election disorder, because I can easily see them allowing Trump voters to intimidate people at polls and cause voter suppression. So that's why, like, early voting, it dilutes that effect. But I don't think he has the balls, or he doesn't have the balls or the resources to just topple the U.S. government. And I don't think even people within the U.S., there's still a huge strain of anti-government, anti-big government, libertarianism. I don't think they would go for it either.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
If he wins, it's because he rigged the election and he took it to courts, and then he had corrupt Republican judges vote. And he knows that's the only way he can do it.
You mean if it's taken to the Supreme Court?
Yeah, his plan is to make the count indeterminable by sabotaging the post office, having lawyers sue against mail-in ballot measures, so he can declare victory on election night. And then he wants to slow down the counting process as much as he can, or just throw out as many ballots as he can, and then make the margin so small that he can take it to court. And then he's hoping the new Supreme Court justice, there's a lot of radical right-wing federal judges that you don't even know about, but they're there now. And he's hoping they will vote in his favor. So that's part of the rush for getting her on the Supreme Court. So he'll go through the legal way. So the only way to combat that is to just vote by overwhelming numbers. And if Biden wins Florida on election night, like 5-6 important states call it night of, there's no way Trump can win the whole thing.
All right. Well, it's definitely something to think about and something to look out for. Thank you for your time, Amer.
3 weeks left.
We have 20 days.
20 days. Wow. Hopefully the world changes for the better.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone who joined us for this really fascinating, in-depth talk today, and hope to see you all next week.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining us, Amer. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Until next time, everybody.
All right. Have a great week.
Bye.